All right, welcome everybody to the Legislative Analyst Fiscal Forecast webinar. My name is Kevin Gordon. I'm president of Capital Advisors Group, and we are the lobbyists proudly of the Small School Districts Association. Happy to be with you. Also joining me today, sort of sitting in on this, and he may add some editorial opinion, is Jack O'Connell, who is one of our founding partners, and of course the former state superintendent. Jack.
Thank you, Kevin. Welcome, everybody. Nice to be with you.
And Leangela Reed, who is one of the key advocates for Small School Districts Association on our team, our senior legislative advocate, and joining us. So we're happy to have Leangela with us. Leangela?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
So one of the things I wanted to make real clear right off the spot, and you can see the little asterisk on slide 1, is all of the, I should say most of the content of this webinar is all the work of the Legislative Analyst Office. We are going through what are mostly their slides and then giving you our take on those slides and basically giving you the outline of what the LAO was conveying when they issued this very critical report just a few weeks ago. There are a couple of slides here, and I'll tell you which ones they are that I have written to sort of give some context to the charts. But most of the slides here produced by the LAO are in chart form. So we'll go to the first slide, and but basically the point, this is one that I created, and it just gives you a little bit of background of what you're seeing. First of all, that this is an annual exercise by the legislative analyst. Every year in the fall, the legislative analyst and I believe the Department of Finance engage in an economic summit that does some forecasting. It doesn't mean that both the LAO and the Department of Finance will draw the same conclusions, but in fact the legislative analyst is the first to basically give its impression of the results of that dialogue in their forecast that they put together, or what I should say is their fiscal outlook. It's a 5-year fiscal outlook. They update it every year, sort of this time of the year. And it's important because it sets the stage for the annual budget process. We look at their revenues and their projections of expenditures and so forth, general health of the budget, and what they're saying about Prop 98. And it lays the groundwork many, many years for a contrast with what will be coming out on January 10th, and perhaps maybe a day or two earlier this year with Governor Brown, you never know, of his proposed state budget for 2015-16. And when the governor does make that proposal, he's not only making a proposal for the budget that starts on July 1st, he's revisiting the numbers for the current fiscal year that we're in, and will also make adjustments to prior years, just as you'll see observations by the legislative analyst on what's going on in those different years as well. So it's not sort of just confined to 15-16. It's about the future. It's about what happened last year. It's about what's happening this year. It covers the fiscal health of the state of California from their vantage point as they look at it right now. The other thing about the legislative analyst report specifically that we're going to talk about are the slides that they've produced that talk about the economy. We have not shared here all of the content of what they've done in their report, so we encourage you to look at that report. But we're going to talk about the economy. We're going to talk about the state budget generally and the general fund and what revenues and expenditures look like. And then we're going to talk a little bit about education specifically, what the prognosis for Prop 98 is, and then also their observations, the legislative analyst's observations about Proposition 2. So with that, let me jump into some of this. Any comments you guys had? Okay. On the economy, so one of the things that we noted right away, Jack and I were looking at this just yesterday, was many of you who have gone to the SSDA budget workshops, which by the way are planned beginning right after the budget comes out. You can get more information on those budget workshops on our website at www.capitaladvisors.org. And that's capital with an O-L, like the building, capitaladvisors.org. You can sign up for those budget workshops. When we did our rounds of budget workshops last year, one of the things that we frequently made reference to was the fact that both the legislative analyst and the Department of Finance had basically one scenario they were looking at, and both of their economic projections were very positive and basically an upward swing in terms of its trajectory over the future, really without any regard to the potential of a downward fall because of a slowing economy or an outright recession again. And we all know that we've had slowdowns, we've had recessions. We are pretty much peaking, and you'll see a slide that they show at 6 years of economic growth, consecutive years of economic growth. We're going to see something slow down here at some point. Well, the kind of cool thing about the LAO scenario is that they produced 3 different scenarios. So they actually have a scenario that talks about the potential of an economic slowdown and what that means in terms of its impact on the budget and obviously its connection ultimately to Proposition 98. They also have what they call a surge scenario, we'll be looking at that, where the economic health of the state is actually better and more robust than even their main projection. And then we have their main projection, which is the one that based on all the economic indicators that they've seen and their own forecasts that they're kind of hanging their hat on, that they think is the one that materializes. But one of the things that Mac Taylor, the legislative analyst, underscored in his press conference was that there's a lot of things going on globally that can affect our economy that we don't have a lot of control over. And any one of these different kinds of variables can make a big difference in kind of where this economy is headed. And so that's why they have those other kinds of projections, and I think that looks good. So anyhow, as I mentioned, the main scenario is positive and stable, and I would sort of borrow those words from Mac Taylor, who suggested that that was the case. It's not that it's, spectacular or incredibly robust. It's a positive and stable is probably the right way to word it. And I would suggest that when we talk about what's going on with regard to education, it's important not to overstate it either, and I'll show you what those numbers look like as well. The story, it was funny because the legislative analyst, when they released this report, did not make a big deal about the implications for Prop 30 and what happens in terms of is there a cliff effect or not on Prop 30 and the revenues that it raised to help bootstrap a really desperate situation for the state's fiscal condition. And we're all happy that Prop 30 passed, but we all know it's also going to be going away. And the legislative analysts didn't make a big deal about what their report suggests, but a reporter, in fact, Dan Walters from the Sacramento Bee, is the person with a couple of real key questions, got a response out of the legislative analyst to help underscore what's in the report, which says that because of the phased out nature of Prop 30, which is that it doesn't all just end, at some certain point, that it actually ends in sort of a tiered approach. You lose some of the revenues. Jack, you know what it is.
The sales tax we lose in about 2 years, and that's 1/4%. And the general rule of thumb is for every 1/4% sales tax, that generates about $1.5 billion. And then the other is the higher tax brackets, right. People filing joint return $500,000 more. And that was more money. That was about $6.5 to $7 billion. And that disappears, just a coincidence, I'm sure, at the same time Governor Brown's term ends.
Yeah.
So that's good for 4 more years. Sales tax is good for 2 years.
So what the legislative analyst said was that because it's phased out, it doesn't all end at the same time, that it really gives the economy an opportunity to grow. And as a result, there will not be a cliff effect. In fact, the columnist Dan Walters specifically pointed out that he said many in the education community are generating a good deal of outcry that we need to have some way to continue those temporary taxes into the future because they're worried about the implications for education. And, he, of course, gets his information from a variety of sources in the education community, none the least of which is the Education Coalition. So he's right that there definitely is a sentiment in the Capitol and certainly within the education community, and I think actually more broadly than that, that those revenues are crucial, and we need to figure out a way to continue them. While the legislative analyst report does show that there is not a cliff effect, one of the things that the analyst does acknowledge in their report is that the implications for K-12 and community colleges within Prop 98 revenue situation flattening out significantly is probably almost entirely due to the expiration of the revenue that's under Prop 30 in those out years. Is that we have pretty good growth in Prop 98, impressive growth in Prop 98, but as soon as Prop 30 phases out, Prop 98 flatlines, and you just don't have that kind of growth. So,
and the governor has said he did not want to continue Prop 30, sold it as a temporary tax, right, Kevin? But he has said that he would favor some type of meaningful tax reform.
So that's one of the things that we're going to look at is the governor, and we'll see what's in the governor's January budget. I don't know that it's something that's going to really emerge till later, but that the governor is interested in tax reform, and as Jack pointed out, absolutely against any kind of extension of the temporary taxes.
And on the political front, the Democrats in Sacramento do not have the two-thirds votes this session that they had 2 years ago, when they could have, certainly sent a signal to the governor they wanted to continue this 2 years ago.
Right, and they certainly would have, with a two-thirds vote in both houses, had the ability. A lot of people don't realize this, to actually enact those temporary taxes on a permanent basis or extend them without a vote of the people. But of course, a major plank in the governor's original election to his third term, when he came back to Sacramento after being gone for so long, was that he would not be in favor of any tax increase that the voters did not approve. And I think he's just trying to stay true to sort of his word on that. So we'll see where this conversation goes, but there's definitely going to be a major conversation this coming year about that tax revenue, because the 2016 election, comes very quickly, and they're going to have to think about what, if anything, they might want to put on that ballot. So the other thing that we noticed from an economic standpoint are the healthy reserves that are created by a combination of both Proposition 2, which was passed just in November. As a result of some of the new revenue coming in, immediately dollars are put aside as required by Proposition 2. But we had a previous ballot measure and efforts by the legislature and prior governors to actually create what was then called a rainy day fund as well. So you have these pre-Prop 2 measures. The combination of those two puts almost $4.2 billion aside for reserve that you're going to see in some of the potential downturn slides that the LAO has produced. It creates a nice safety net for those situations. But there are some pretty good protections against the legislature spending down the Prop 2 money, but it looks like the legislature might have some flexibility to do something about some of the reserve dollars that were set aside previous to the Prop 2 adoption. So and then let's go ahead and take a look at some of these charts. So this first chart talks about the economic expansion that's well underway and how, in their view, under their main scenario, it continues throughout the forecast period. You can see the way that you can see what happened between 07 and just a couple of years ago in 2012, and you can see, or 2011, and you can see the climb out over time and what that looks like. Then we take a look at the unemployment rate, clearly a leading economic indicator, and it's dropping a great deal. We basically recovered, for the most part, to where we were in pre-recession levels and unemployment. Property values, this slide's important because, and it's particularly important to the state of California, because as property tax values grow and we get assessments that reflect those increased property values, greater property tax revenue, which is in the projection going out, helps the state lower its general fund obligation to schools. Because for every additional dollar you get in property tax revenue generated, that's $1 less that the state's general fund has to put into the pie for a school funding. So Believe me, folks at the state capitol building love it when they see local property values increasing, assessed valuations go up, and actually generating new property tax dollars. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the state budget, move from the economy to the state budget and the general fund revenues specifically. So one of the things you'll see in the charts, and we'll go through these, is a really good revenue situation overall for the state. It's up in 2012-13 a little bit, and then we've got a pretty good increase in the current year that we're in the middle of. And one of the things that we note here is several things create almost all of the money going to K-12 and community college under Prop 98. There are interactions that drive most of the money to Prop 98, which is not going to be something that will excite all of the parts of the budget that are on the Prop 98 side. So you can imagine for a lot of the different interest groups who work on state budget issues to know that, you know, the economy is recovering and more revenue is being generated into the general fund, but almost all of it goes to schools, is going to be an unhappy reality for the University of California, California State University, and all the other segments of the budget that are not under Prop 98. So that's what's going on with regard to current year and the little bit of an uptick in 12-13. We have a similar situation with the next budget year that starts July 1, and that is that you have, you know, modest revenue growth, but again, a significant amount of that money will go to education. Let's go. And then I mentioned before in the last slide about the $4.2 billion in reserves, puts the general fund, the general fiscal condition of the state in good shape, and you're seeing a reaction from the bond rating agencies and just everybody that looks at California is kind of a remarkable story of recovery. Here's some of the charts that the legislative analyst has put together. Here you can see when the legislative analyst mentions the big three, and Jack makes reference to these all the time in our budget workshops. The big three, if you look at the center of this slide, it has a box. It shows the corporate tax, sales and use tax, and personal income. Personal income, as we've said over and over again, is the overwhelming driver of what goes on with regard to growth in the general fund, and also is what is the culprit when we have a downturn typically. I mean, we watch the other two as well, but personal income tax has a disproportionate impact on what's going on with the state's economic and fiscal health. So you see that slight increase in revenues in 13-14, and then you see the increase in 14-15, $2.1 billion, and we in education will actually end up with slightly more than that because of the anomalies of Prop 98. We chew up all of that and then some. And then here, this chart is a good chart to show you what happens with regard to reserves at the very bottom. You can see we end up with $4.22 billion in reserves, and the reserves are both from Prop 2, budget stabilization account balance, and then you have the pre-Prop 2 budget stabilization amount. And this is where the legislature could, if they wanted to, say, look at there are some of those dollars that, given some other priorities of the legislature, that we may not want to have go completely into, be set aside for reserves if they can justify using the funds for some other purpose, and they might. The legislative analyst has cautioned significantly for them to take care in doing anything like that, and that they ought to keep the reserve exactly where it is, anticipating that there might be a downturn in the economy. So here's the LAO's outlook on the revenue generally, and this goes all the way out to 1920. This slide is very similar to the ones we showed you all last year with the legislative analysts, which was their mainline economic forecast that showed nothing but increasing revenue and a good economy stretched out over time. And this sort of reflects that. You can see, pretty good revenue growth over the longer term. Then we take a look at here is the LAO's main scenario, and it does show what happens after 2014, which is that you have less of a materialization of the capital gains revenue because obviously we're going to be losing some of that tax revenue that is mostly all related to income. And you see the projection line, you see where the DOF's line has been. You know, one of the other things that I like to sort of make sure we point out when we talk about overall general fund health and revenue projections is the fact that we've had a almost, you know, annual dance around here with the governor on him projecting revenues that were lower than the legislative analysts. And that what ends up happening, and you know, it's just a matter of months after the particular budget cycle we might be in, that we discovered that the LAO's numbers were probably a little closer to reality. But again, you know, the governor's projections are a mixture of wanting to be pragmatic and conservative, but also have an element of politics to them. And that is that, you know, you show a big, huge, healthy group jump up in numbers, and there tends to be an inclination to want to spend it. And I think the governor has tried to be more conservative, and I think you'll see that in the January budget as well. So here are a combination of two things, reserve deposits and future surpluses under the legislative analyst's main scenario. You can see what's required by Proposition 2 under the budget stabilization account deposit requirements. And there are a couple of different components there that add to this. And then the remaining budget surplus that we end up having. And again, the legislative analyst is not proposing that we make any big changes with regard to where those dollars are. Okay, now here's the reserve slide that the legislative analyst produced, and this shows you how they take a look at the way the reserve can help create a safety net against one of their scenarios, which is this hypothetical economic slowdown in the first quarter of 2016. So you can see the budget shortfall in the first year in 16-17 would be addressed completely by reserves, but in the following years you would have to do some adjustments in order to accommodate what would be an economic slowdown in terms of cuts, programmatic cuts, and that sort of thing. So obviously we'd be up against that. We are hoping, we like the fact that they're looking at the possibility of a downturn so we can make plans for that, but we're certainly hoping that their main scenario is the one that takes place. And then I threw in this slide that they had on debt service because it relates to the big debate that's going to be held this year about a school bond. And a lot of conversation always about what is the state's overall debt service obligation, and should we be passing more bonds, or maybe shouldn't pass more bonds because we don't want to up that amount. And Jack, I guess I'll just ask you, I mean, you've been involved with bond elections forever, is that when you were in the legislature, was there ever any real science to what the common or conventional knowledge or wisdom was about what that number should be?
I actually asked the legislative analyst years ago what she thought that magical number would be, and the answer was 5%. It's somewhat arbitrary, but said if you're hovering right around that 5%, would advocate not going above 5% because of the impact on general fund, and also potentially on the credit rating of the state. So the answer that I received at the time was 5%.
So obviously it says it's remaining under 6, so it's probably right around the range it ought to be. But there will be a lot of conversation about doing something more. And then you take a look at this, is that they suggest that we keep it, that it retains this kind of level through the projection period, but I'm sure that the legislative analyst is not anticipating the passage of any further bonds when they do this projection.
And yet I would assume that the passage of Proposition 2, which you referenced already, which received nearly 70% of the vote last month, and the creation of the state, actually the expansion, the additional generation of money for the state reserve could help this and could help us retire some of the bond and indebtedness of the state. Perhaps some of those interest rates that are even higher than you can right now. I mean, there are some that suggest when you have these record low interest rates like we have now, this is the time to be passing the bond and be making that type of investment.
Right. No, that's a really, really good point. So there'll be a lot of discussion about bonds. I mean, I just wanted to take the opportunity, since we had the slide, to to talk about the fact that there was a major effort, and we were involved with it as well, to try to do something for the 2014 ballot. That did not happen. The governor was very clear about what he wanted to have on the ballot, which was very little, because he didn't want it to interfere with his Prop 2 and Proposition 1. And, you know, his politics and political wisdom, you can look at the numbers on the passage rate on these two ballot measures.
Was he for those two propositions, Kevin? I kind of missed that. Yeah.
So anyhow, he was successful, obviously, and now we get to debate a school bond this year. And
I'm not sure if he passed them or if they passed him.
So, exactly. If you take a look at that campaign, it was the election, the non-election election of the governor. Anyhow, if you take a look at what's sort of in store for 2015, there'll be a good, healthy debate about school bonds by those, including us, that think one is absolutely essential, versus I know some point of view, and the governor shares this particular point of view, that we basically shouldn't have and we won't have another school bond, that it's got to be shouldered by local districts and using other means. One of the very controversial potential outcomes of this will be funding school facilities, albeit on a very tiny level, through Prop 98 or the general fund at the very least. I'll tell you that if there's a proposal that says it's going to get funded out of Prop 98, there's going to be a fight had in the Capitol building launched by the education community, because we've never used Prop 98 for that purpose. And the use of Prop 98 funds for that purpose really conflicts with the governor's own signature reform, which is every Prop 98 dollar you siphon off for something other than LCFF implementation only pushes out or delays the full implementation of LCFF, and I think everyone in the community wants that thing implemented as quickly as possible. Let's get districts to their targets, and then we can move on, and we'll have COLA and growth going on beyond that once we all get to our targets.
And there is, unfortunately, a precedent for an attempt to use Prop 98 funding related to bonds, and that was to use Prop 98 money for the interest of the education bonds. And the education community rose up, uniformly rejected that, and then the legislature and the governor walked away from that ill-conceived proposal as well.
Right. So hopefully we'll all be together if that occurs again. Anyways, that was probably, you know, not one of the cornerstone slides of the entire LAO proposal, but it helped us make a couple of other points that we think it's important for you to note. Now we turn to the education piece in particular and Prop 98. And as I mentioned earlier, the debate over revenues every year, whether it's January or the May revision or the final Budget Act, you know, when they're talking about whose revenue figure is right, that has a direct impact on Prop 98. And sometimes the reason why somebody might have a higher or lower figure directly relates to their view about how Prop 98 should be funded, better or worse. So you see those connections. As we mentioned, the governor has consistently, in the last 2 budget years, been very conservative in his projections of what revenue would look like, only to find that a good deal more revenue actually materialized and helped boost what we would have otherwise been getting under Prop 98. So we have a significant amount of money, as much as $2.1 billion, almost $2.3 billion, we'll show you the slides, are going to materialize in the current fiscal year under Prop 98, and a good deal of that will go immediately toward retiring deferrals, which a trigger was set up that if we did get the money we thought we were going to get, it would go to retire those deferrals. And I think that's actually going to happen, and that's a very good thing. And then you can count on the governor using a good deal of that money for one-time types of purposes and not wanting to spend it on anything ongoing, because virtually all the money is one-time money. So that makes sense.
And that would be for things like technology, for further implementation of Common Core, perhaps anything related to Common Core and the new assessments coming around the corner. So this is the way we envision it.
And the governor has been very consistent on this, even during his first 2 terms as governor. Some of you may remember that back in the late 70s, which really led to Prop 13, the property tax limitation initiative. The state at the time, the state general fund was around $17, $18 billion. The surplus was about 40% of that. You talk about the quote obscene state surplus. And the reason the governor didn't want to spend that money was nothing on an ongoing basis, because he knew, and he was right, that that level of revenue coming in was not sustainable indefinitely. And so he wanted to rather, kind of not spend that, not create new programs that the state wouldn't be able to sustain in the long term.
So a couple things. One of the things that Leangela pointed out, which is really important, is that the money that materializes in the current fiscal year, this 2.1 plus, it's probably more closer to $2.3 billion, is money that people would naturally think makes some sense. There's probably about $1 billion after you pay off deferrals of spendable money there that makes sense for you to use for Common Core implementation and some of those kinds of things. But there's a lot of different uses that are potential there. She'd mentioned technology, and I know you always talk about, Leangela, professional development.
Yes.
Instructional materials.
And instructional materials. And the one observation I want to make is that last year when we passed the budget, and everybody thought this revenue was going to show up. We would have preferred, frankly, that it went into the budget.
Right.
But it didn't go into the budget. It got delayed, and now we see it actually did materialize. And what the governor did is he put a very, very small amount of money out to the field, relatively speaking, in the context of $1.25 billion that he spent a year and a half ago on Common Core. He put about $450 million out on a per-kid basis and called it mandate money, he called it Common Core money, and he called it help to defray some of the expenses of STRS. It was a threefer, but it was basically discretionary money. But if you note, he said some of this is for implementation of Common Core without reference to the 3 silos that we are concerned about. We've always said we thought that each of those 3 very crucial areas to make Common Core successful probably deserved over $1 billion each. And so one of the things that might happen with this new revenue materializing, one-time revenue, is it may give the governor a significantly increased amount of money to do something more serious in those areas. We'll see what he does with the state budget. But anything else, Liam?
Well, or maybe even something to address the career tech issue.
Yeah, there's career check rock rope that's got to have. Now he may do some of that with the 15-16 budget, and we're going to talk about that next. As I mentioned in the last bullet, that you have a big 2015-16 on Prop 98, and the reason why is not because revenue growth in that year is particularly good in the general fund. It's really because so much of the money the governor has allocated, for this year and previously, because it's all one time, he pays down the deferrals. That was a one-time type of action. What occurs is after you start paying down all these one-time obligations, suddenly you have this big chunk of money that materializes in the 15-16 budget that you have for ongoing purposes, and it amounts to about a $6.4 billion chunk of capacity for the legislature to budget. Now, we think, keeping with what Jack was talking about, that even though he has that sort of ongoing capacity of a big dollar amount, he probably will pick a lot of one-time type efforts to be supporting, so that if, let's say, the LAO's downturn scenario, the slowdown scenario happened in the first quarter of 2016, he would easily be able to accommodate that in the combination of the reserves that he has because of Prop 2 and the fact that most of his big spending in K-12 has been one time.
Right.
So he'll really be able to accommodate that easily if that's the case. This slide is the one that shows what the growth is over these couple of fiscal years. So you see in 13-14 a little bit of an uptick there in terms of what we're going to be getting in the minimum Prop 98 guarantee. This is a slide that illustrates what's going on with Prop 98 specifically. So you see that $177 million there. And then you take a look at what the difference is between June, when the Budget Act was done, and this estimate that was just done in this forecast, $2.3 billion higher in terms of what the Prop 98 guarantee is. Now, many people thought the Prop 98 guarantee was about right at this level in terms of what would materialize for 14-15 when we passed the budget. But the governor wanted to be conservative and go into this election cycle not showing this number. But now you roll forward a few months and the number starts to materialize. So as we mentioned before, here's that 15-16, what happens, that bottom line number, minimum guarantee, 65 $65 billion, almost $66 billion. Total new funds available in 15-16 go with a line above it, $6.4 billion. So, and you can see all those one-time types of purposes that he spent up above, which gives him the ability to have a really nice ongoing balance to invest in education priorities. That's why I think this is such a big number. That's why I think one of the things the governor might do if he decides to use Prop 98 money for facilities, and we, of course, would not react favorably to that, the governor's response is going to be, I had enough money to do that and still invest in an impressive increase in LCFF accelerated funding, which is, I think, what he's going to try to do. So mark my words on that one, folks. Expect that to happen, so we'll see. Here's the slowdown scenario, what happens to Prop 98 that the LAO projects. Again, a early 2016 economic slowdown and what the corresponding effect is on the Prop 98 guarantee, and you see it there in the dark blue. And then you can see, you know, what we're hoping for is the main scenario, the middle column. I'm looking at 15-16 and 16-17, but you can see what happens in the slowdown scenario. We do have the Prop 98 guarantee coming down, and that is something that right now the governor's budget actions combined with the reserves would help mitigate. And here's the main line. Prop 98 outlook tracks very closely with, if you go back to the slide on what's going on with general fund revenue, obviously there's a corresponding sort of nature to these two slides that you'll see. And then here's what's going on, and this is kind of an important thing, is that the Prop 90 guarantee and the growth in it comes significantly from local property tax increases. You can see what the general fund share is in terms of the change from prior year, each prior year, and the local property tax is helping to fill in the total bucket on Prop 98 considerably in each of these years. And then I threw this on there, which was to take a look at the cost of living adjustment. And while the COLA clearly is, you know, ever upward going forward here, I want to remind people that the cost of living adjustment for education only increases the target under LCFF. It doesn't mean each and every year prior to you reaching your target that there's some dollar amount that's earmarked for a cost of living increase. Our friends in labor are, you know, definitely catching on to this, that, you know, when we used to always ask what the COLA was, you know, that's not the right question, because for many districts that have not gotten to their target yet and won't for 5 or 6 more years, the COLA only increases the target. Now, once we get to full implementation of LCFF, you will have been restored to 07, 08 levels adjusted for inflation, meaning that the COLA has been fully adjusted for all of these years, and it's in that number. So I just want to make sure we make that point. Then to Prop 2, we'll talk a little bit about Prop 2, which is that Prop 2 built upon, you know, almost $2 billion in existing reserves. The additional total dollar amounts that Prop 2 generates goes for 2 things. It goes for debt buy down and for building a reserve. 2 things, and they're not, you know, they're definitely not the same. Debt buy down is exactly what Jack O'Connell was talking about a second ago. Jack, you were talking about, you know, our goal, which should be to take bond debt and retire that, to take, and the legislative analyst has their own recommendations for debt priorities. The governor, as I mentioned here, the governor and lawmakers will definitely have theirs. I expect the governor's January budget will suggest what kind of debts he wants to pay down. For us, it would be great if he could pay down bond debt on whatever general obligation bond debt he has, because that would increase capacity then for us to do something on education.
Bring that under 5%.
Yeah. Anything else you want to mention on Prop 2? Yeah. Okay. And then here's a menu of potential debts that Prop 2 could potentially, you know, pay for. So there's all these different things that are on here. And Prop 98 settle up is one of those things. That would be nice. And, you know, he may choose to do that. You know, take some money to put into school facilities under Prop 98, but then with his Prop 2 money, pay off some of the Prop 98 obligation. we'll see what he chooses to do. The LAO in particular is interested in them paying down the judges' retirement system.
I can't believe they're not making a more significant investment in the legislative retirement system. That disappoints me greatly.
I bet. I bet, Jeff.
Disappoints Mrs. O'Connell even more.
So, so here's the near-term plan, and then, of course, the legislative analyst is making recommendations here on what you might do in terms of to debt payments and where we would put that money. So a whole new conversation about money that's basically been set aside for debt retirement, and a big healthy debate about how to do it and when to do it, and there's actual resources to help you do it. In other budget years, the notion that we would be able to have a set-aside pot of money that we could debate about what debts we want to pay down was just unheard of. I mean, it's great to be in this particular posture. I think everybody would agree. So I know that we had this thing scheduled to be an hour, I think it was, and we obviously are quicker than that, but I wanted to just see if my colleagues have anything in particular you want to add.
Kevin, one of the things that's not appropriately not in the forecast, but something that is around the corner, is the pressures that the legislature is going to be putting on the budgetary situation for their own asks. There's going to be, whenever there's extra money, there's always extra wishes.
Right.
And so there's going to be, I think there's going to be some things tied to education relative to English learners and foster youth pushes for funding obligations. I think there's going to be some more push for technology. And I think there's going to be a big push for the new immigrants that are being accepted into the state and some state service funding for those that we haven't expected and obviously aren't in the forte, but those sort of bends in the river that are coming. Right. The other piece that's going to be coming is for districts to remember that the ELA, ELD adoptions are going to be next fall, and right now there's no money, being talked about specifically for those instructional materials. With next generation science standard coming right after that, and history right after that. So while the fiscal situation looks good, there's going to be a lot of things that come out in the next few months.
Very good.
And I would just add, we talked about Proposition 2 that the voters passed, almost 70% of the vote. And then some of our friends have really been quite concerned. And my counsel is don't lose sleep over that provision that said you can only have a budget reserve for your local school district, for your LEA, of either 3 or 4%, depending upon the size of your district. I mean, that's not going to kick in for probably 5 or 6 years. Maintenance factor has to be totally repaid. It's only when we're on test 1, which since 1988 we've been on, I believe it'll be 4 years if this is the year. And even then, the county superintendent of schools can exempt you 2 out of 3 years. So while some people are going to talk about a repeal of that, and we'll try to help orchestrate that one provision, other people want to simply try to modify it. I would suggest, don't lose sleep over it. It's not going to kick in for several years, even if ever.
2 reminders that I wanted to give you all is, again, the Budget Perspectives Workshop, which is co-sponsored by the Small School Districts Association. We're going to be doing the first round in 22 locations across the state in January, right after the governor's budget comes out, so right after the 10th of January. We're going to be all over the state. We do them all over the state for one reason, and that is to accommodate small school districts. So that instead of you having to drag your rear end all the way down to Sacramento or wherever that might be, we try to create opportunities closer to your community so you can learn all about the budget in settings that are smaller so you can get questions and actually be part of the dialogue. That's the point. So look for those budget workshops at www.capitaladvisors.org.
And what's the price of those workshops, Kevin?
Free. They're free.
And
so
I believe that
we make a profit based upon volume.
I believe SSDA is also going to post them on their site as well.
Oh, great. That'll be good. And then the SSDA annual conference in March 11th through the 13th, here in Sacramento, over at McClellan. We're all very involved with that event, giving you sort of political prognosis and an update of what's going on at the state level, as well as a rich itinerary of other parts of the program that are just targeted to small school districts. So we really encourage you, March 11th through 13th, to register for that conference. And I want to thank you all so much for participating. We are going to be sending out an updated final version of this PowerPoint, the one that you just saw. The one that was sent out beforehand had a couple of little quirks in it that we wanted to kind of make sure were correct. So we've gotten a final version that's going to be coming to you shortly. Now, Shelley, who's helping us from SSDA on this, were you going to ask for questions?
Yes, if anybody has any questions that they would like to address to the presenters, please use the button on the right-hand side that says questions. Type those in, and I'd be happy to forward them on. So we'll leave the floor open for just a little bit longer.
Great, and I see your message right there, Shelley. It came up about questions, so we'll wait for those. All right. I guess we were very thorough.
Complete.
Yeah, I think we're good. I don't have any questions as of yet.
Terrific. Well, Shelley, thank you, too. I want to acknowledge your help in making this happen. Shelley Tillery, who's with SSDA, and Deb Pearson, who is the great executive director of the organization. We're just doing, it's very exciting, the work that we're all doing together, and certainly Dave Walrath, who's been a real instrumental part of our advocacy team. Thank you all for listening in today, and we look forward to chatting with you soon, either at the budget workshops or at the next webinar that we're going to be doing next month. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Kevin.
Bye.
Thank you.